So we need to further clarify the difference between Pilgrim and Puritan. Puritans were ones who want to purify the Church of England but not separate. A separatist was one who said, this fucking church is corrupt, fuck this church, we're going to do our own thing. William Bradford, he was a Protestant who believed that he could read the Bible and interpret for himself what it meant. And the only thing that mattered really to him was if people got together in a congregation and they did it for Jesus, for God, that you prayed together. He was against the popes, against the bishops, against even the building itself. Because what mattered was the people being together in, their love of the Lord. So William Bradford would have been a separatist. They also called him a Brownist. So William Bradford was the Plymouth colony, and then you had a Massachusetts Bay colony and a Connecticut colony. You also had Dutch colonies in Virginia. Virginia's going to have all these slaves, whereas eventually New England gets rid of it, so there is a line of demarcation. And another thing was William Bradford. William Bradford had established Plymouth colony for about 10 years. Or, no, I guess 30 years or something, or 37 years. But the 30 years or so that he was at Plymouth, eventually Plymouth becomes Massachusetts. Eventually Plymouth colony joins the Massachusetts Bay colony. And the Massachusetts Bay colony were Puritans. So William Bradford's Plymouth colony, who wouldn't be the first comers, but he called himself the first comers, he was there in the very, in the beginning, but Jamestown was just like a couple years earlier. So in his mind, he was one of the first comers, and there's a lot of crazy shit. I mean, the Pilgrims. Well, I just watched that film, the American Experience on PBS, and it was amazing. They walk. Finally, they get to Cape Cod. They get to where the Plymouth plantation is going to be. And when they were walking around America, they found this grave, and they found one grave that had two skeletons. One skeleton had blonde hair, an adult figure, and it was wrapped up in this like red, blanket or something. And so there's an adult male or adult person, adult bones that had blonde hair. There's still skin on the bones. And then they saw this kid, like an Indian kid, who had all these Indian beads on it. And they couldn't, why would an adult, blonde person, meaning it was European, they didn't see any other Europeans except for that dead body, and then that little Indian kid. And then they were hungry, right? They finally got there. When they first got there, you have Dorothy Bradford, William Bradford's wife, who just jumps overboard. And supposedly she fell overboard and just died. William Bradford never talked about it, but a lot of people speculate. There was a lot of despair. There was poverty, starvation. Half the Pilgrims died the first year. There's 102 Pilgrims or so, and then there was 52 Pilgrims. And it wasn't even the first year. It's after 3 months. They got there late in the fall. So after 3 months, you have half of the Pilgrims, dying, succumbing to starvation. And, big shocker. They're a company, I don't know, I would like to think William Bradford seems like he's kind of legit, right? Just wants to do this little separatist colony, wants to, be the best goddamn Christian, in the world. And, but I think that he comes under the Virginia company. He comes, trying to establish a colony. So, of course, his paymasters want to see a return. So they want the gold, they want the silver, they want the land and slaves. And when they get there and they're not able to do this, and half of them died off, either starvation or maybe they got killed off, and then it kind of, there was despair. And then another thing I heard too was there were so many people that were dying. Half of them had died within the first 3 months, that they were actually propping their bodies up in the woods, so that way the Native Americans would know that they would think that they knew that there were more English people than what they had supposed. Cause they propped them up. So a dead body, they was propping them up in the middle of the woods just to give the illusion that they had more English people and that they were like sentinels and that they were propped up ready to engage in battle. So it's really fucked up. When I read about Jamestown, I read that there were cannibals. They were cannibalizing each other. They got so hungry, and then there was this, the evidence of some bone, the head was all bashed in, and so they think that they killed her. They think that they killed her, and then they ate her. And I don't know if that's like a Salem witch trial. Maybe, the woman was, maybe she was a witch, and so they had to, stone her to death because of that. But when you're starving, you have no food, half of the people are dying, and there's meat on the bones, I don't think it's that big of a stretch to think that they might have been cannibalizing them. So get this straight, Puritans, Pilgrims, okay? William Bradford is a Separatist. The John Winthrop, who eventually establishes or is the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is the first major settlement after the Plymouth Colony. John Winthrop, he is a Puritan. He's a Puritan, and William Bradford is a Separatist. But eventually, when Massachusetts Bay Colony was established 30 years or so after Plymouth, and I guess it's actually 1630, I don't know. My point is, Plymouth eventually becomes Massachusetts Bay Colony. Eventually, Plymouth joins with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and when they did that, they had said that they wouldn't tell them how to live their life. They would not insult them whatsoever. So I guess they actually had a great respect for William Bradford, even though the Puritans, John Winthrop, believed in the Church of England, thought that the Church of England would have been better and done a better job. They still believed that you could reform it, but you could still keep the church, whereas William Bradford said, fuck the church, we're going to do our own thing. But when they had invited them, when Plymouth Plantation became a part of Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were very respectful of it, even though Puritans and Separatists were very different. One of the major differences, their whole philosophy is different, right? One thinks reform and one thinks reform can't even be possible. But even more importantly, it was illegal. There was no separation of church and state in England. So if you said, let's separate it from the church, you were literally breaking the law. You not only were you in sin and you're going to go to hell, but you could also go to jail, right? And I would think the jail thing is probably a greater motivator than some, imaginary person in the sky or in the ground. Oh no, there's an imaginary person in the ground. So, the HistoryNewsNetwork.org, myth number 8, Pilgrims, Puritans, same thing. Even though presidents get this wrong, and I've made a couple of them and I was wrong. Ronald Reagan once referred to Puritan John Winthrop as a pilgrim, but Pilgrims and Puritans were two different groups. Now, I guess they're trying to say Pilgrims are the first newcomers, right? Because to make a pilgrimage means you're the first ones. And they're Separatist. But the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower, lived in Plymouth. The Puritans arriving a decade later. So Massachusetts Bay Colony established themselves 10 years later. I just saw on Wikipedia that it said 30 years that Plymouth Plantation had been in existence. So I guess Massachusetts Bay Colony establishes themselves at Boston 10 years later, and then maybe 30 years later Plymouth Plantation becomes integrates or lives at Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was way more successful. There was like 1,000 people the first year that was there, and that was still 3 times the amount that had been at Plymouth Plantation while they were there for 10 years. So the Pilgrims welcome heterogeneousness, which I'm shocked about. Puritans arrived a decade later, settled in Boston. Some so-called strangers came to America in search of riches. Others, so-called saints, came for religious reasons. So they're saying that Pilgrims, William Bradford was a separatist, a Brownist separatist, a very specific separatist. But they're saying that some of the Pilgrims are actually there for money, for riches, and for gold, right? And then other people came for religious reasons. So apparently Plymouth Plantation wasn't this utopia, or maybe it was a utopia, because in the Puritans, they were allowed to, they want to worship the way they want to worship, but they forced everybody else to worship their way. And this right here, according to History News Network, was the Pilgrims welcomed heterogeneousness. So apparently they were more tolerant, which I've never heard anything about them being tolerant. William Bradford was against Christmas. They didn't celebrate it the first time, and then the second time there's a guy that comes on one of the new ships who was going to celebrate it, and he was kind of like, well, do it in your house because we don't do that. We don't do that kind of pagan bullshit around here. The fucking Christmas, keep your Christmas in your house. The Pilgrims, the Separatists, didn't like Christmas. It was a pagan holiday. They were anti-Christmas tree. They were anti the holiday of Christmas. So let's carry on. The Puritans, in contrast, came over to America strictly in search of religious freedom. So that's all the Puritans want. Not freedom for all, but just freedom for them to practice how they wanted to, religion, how they do religion. They do not welcome dissent. That would confuse Pilgrims and Puritans would have horrified both of them. So Puritans and Pilgrims were both, different. They were different in bloody spirit. Well, actually, they were both English and they're both Christian. There's not that much difference. But in their minds, they're like, man, fuck them Puritans or fuck them Pilgrims or Separatists. They weren't called Pilgrims actually until 30 years after the Civil War. So we actually started, calling them Pilgrims way longer in reflection. So Puritans considered the Pilgrims incurable utopians, while both shared the belief that the Church of England had become corrupt. Only the Pilgrims believed that it was beyond redemption, and that's why they're separatists. They chose the path of separatism, and God have mercy on their soul. Puritans, however, held out hope that the church could reform. And now we know today that the Church of England is the goodest, most holy, Puritans are not the same thing as Pilgrims, because Puritans came 10 years later. Pilgrims were separatists, not Puritans. William Bradford is Pilgrim, separatist. John Winthrop of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a Puritan.